Well, folks, in today's video, I'm going to be giving you guys 5 different tips for starting off your first model train layout. This is a question I receive quite a bit during my live streams where somebody is looking to start their first model railway layout, and they're looking for a bit of advice. So hopefully this video will be able to answer some of those questions, as well as give you guys some alternative ideas on how to get the most out of your model railway layout within any limits you may or may not have. And that brings me to my number 1 tip, which is determining how much space you have to work with. Now, I'm quite fortunate at the moment, and I live in a house with quite a large basement, so real estate is really not a problem. And a lot of people will build their layouts in basements, or garages, or attics. And if you happen to have one of those in your house that's viable to build a layout, I would say that's probably your number 1 bet because you'll get the most space out of it. But not everybody has that option. Some people don't have a basement, or they have an attic that you can't walk in, or some people are living in an apartment where they don't have either. So in those cases, you have to get a little bit more creative. In some cases, you can build a layout like this one, where it's not at all attached to the feet. So at any time, you could lift your layout up and you can place it up against a wall where it's not taking up near to as much space. But there are more creative options which might allow you to do a little bit more. And one of the first places that comes to mind is under a bed, and a lot of people don't put anything under their beds, and there's usually enough room to build a layout. In this case, this bed measures just over 6 feet in length, and it measures just over 4 feet in width. And it measures about close to 10 inches in height, just a little under. So that can be very important if you want to go this route. In this case, those measurements would be enough to more than fit this industrial layout right here, which is fitted up with 22 radius curves, which can handle the majority of large locomotives and rolling stock. And the height would still be enough to fit almost every building on here except this one. Even the rock face could fit. So there's enough room to build a pretty decent layout. Another thing to note about space is that if you don't have a ton of space, you might want to consider going to a bigger scale if you're not already committed to one. N scale is obviously significantly smaller than HO scale, so if you want to build like a great big train yard and you don't have a ton of room, N scale might be your better choice. But if you have a lot of space, I would personally go with HO simply because I find it's easier to work on. Once you've determined how much space you have to work with, it's time for tip number 2, which is creating a great big list of all the things you might want on your model railway layout. Get yourself a great big pad of paper like this one and a pen, and go through as much train-related media as you possibly can to find as many things you might potentially want on your model railway layout. You can watch YouTube videos, you can search for images of model railroads online. If you happen to know anybody who's in the community, a lot of them have a stack of old model railway magazines that they'll be more than happy to lend you or even give to you for free. And just go through as much as you possibly can and write down anything you see that you might like. There's never a bad idea because you can always take them away later, but it gives you a lot of extra ideas and might make a layout that you want a little bit more. And don't limit yourself necessarily to model railroads. You can search up real railroads as well. Get ideas from anywhere you can. That's part of the fun of it, and make yourself a great big list. Once you've written your great big list in horrible handwriting, as I have, it brings me to tip number 3, which is creating a budget. You can go on websites like Amazon, eBay, Train World, even go to model train shops, and see how much all these things you want for your layout, how much they're going to add up to, and what you can afford at the moment, and what you have to put on the back burner. Now, putting things on the back burner is an interesting strategy, because what you can do is you can edit off a whole bunch of very expensive things that you want to add, and you can add them long in the future. So this will be quite exciting if you build your layout, and if things are getting a bit dull, you can add something new to it, and it will become exciting, and it really makes a layout that you can kind of grow with, and I find it makes it a lot more interesting. Keep in mind when you're writing one of these lists, though, for your budget, put things like track controllers, etc. on the front of the budget, and I would suggest putting things like buildings aside unless you have the means, because you want to obviously have good track and a good controller, and you don't want to cut corners on those things because you bought a roundhouse for $300. And space is also a limiting factor. Again, if you don't have a ton of space, go for the smaller things, because if you fit a lot of small things, it adds a lot of kind of interesting detail. If you add a massive roundhouse that takes up almost half of your layout, it's really not going to be worth it in the end, in my opinion, because it's just going to hog up a lot of space that you could put a lot of other interesting things. So go through and edit and determine what you have means for, what you don't, and put the things you don't have means for or don't have the room for. Either say, okay, I no longer want this, or say, hey, some date in the future, when I can get it, I'll get it and add it to my layout. So once you've determined how much space you have to work with and what kind of budget you have, and you actually go out and buy the materials to build your layout, that brings me to tip number 4, which is to not rush into constructing your layout ridiculously quickly. I know it's very tempting when you have all the raw materials right there and it's ready to get constructed just to dive in and just go wild with it. But taking your time really does pay off, especially with track work. You want to make sure you got every single rail joiner lined up correctly. There's not any major gaps in the track. Otherwise, you're going to have a lot of problems up the road, and it's going to turn a very fun thing into a very frustrating thing. So don't just dive into it right away. You know, take your time with it, as boring as that might be. It will pay off in the future. But that's not to say take forever and think it through too much. I also see the opposite problem where people just sit kind of determining how they should take care of it. Actually start putting things together. Just don't put them together, you know, like that, you know. Put them together with meaning. And taking your time with your layout goes far beyond track work. Obviously with the scenery, that's another area where you really want to take your time and get the level of detail that you want. I find one of the best ways to do this is to break your layout up into 1x1 squares and work on that little, you know, 1x1 foot square until you are happy with the level of detail, and then move on to another one. Because I know when you very first start off and you have all this space, you just want to fill it with stuff and get a layout going. But what you don't want to be doing is just filling areas with grass and making fields, you know. In my experience, you really want to get the most out of the area, so really take your time. And while you're working on that, I find you sometimes get new ideas that you didn't have originally. So for example, when I was constructing this area, I cut it up into 1 cubes, I was working on this one, and the locomotive that you see here used to be there, and I was originally just going to leave it there, but then while I was working on that, I was like, hey, I can move that there, and hey, I can put the grocery store there, and all of a sudden, you know, I had all these new ideas, and as a result, I got an area of the layout which I'm much more happy with. So work on an area until you're happy with it, and then move on to another one, and try to avoid just taking it all on at once, because honestly, even if you have a small layout, a blank layout is still a lot of space. And that brings me to step number 5, which is keeping track of the most important thing of the entire model railroading hobby and of building your first layout, which is having a good time while you do it. I highly suggest when you're building your first layout that you seek the advice of people who have expertise in the hobby, people who have had, you know, many years of experience, because they can give you tons of very good advice. But be careful with some of that advice. And the reason I say that is because there are some people in this hobby who believe that if you're building a railroad, it has to have a specific timeline and a specific setting. And adding those limiters in some cases can really suck the fun out of something that's supposed to be exciting. You can build giant trees out of Play-Doh if you want. You can, you know, make your grass out of paint. It doesn't matter. Just as long as you're having fun, you're doing it right. And anybody who tells you otherwise is taking the hobby way too seriously and should definitely be ignored. Anyways, guys, that's all my tips for starting your first layout. I'll probably make another video in the future because I'm sure I forgot a whole bunch, but these are just a lot of the things that came to mind over the years while building my layouts, and their advice I hope that others can use to build their layouts. So I hope this video helped, and hopefully I'll have more kind of ideas, because people ask me a lot of questions about these things, and to me, if a few people are asking these questions, there might be a lot of people who maybe are not watching the live stream at that moment, or are not seeing the answer to those questions. So hopefully this can answer other people's questions as well. So thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you guys enjoyed.